This is your temporary sign-on, just to get your own. I need you to love it.
Right!
Got your fucking friend.
Sorry, pal.
Just let them do their jobs, okay?
We're 6 minutes.
Imagine a city where millions of dollars move through the streets every single day, hidden inside armored trucks and protected by heavily armed security guards, and where one carefully planned robbery can turn an ordinary morning into a deadly battlefield. Because this is the world of Wrath of Man, a brutal action thriller directed by Guy Ritchie, and at the center of the story is a mysterious man known only as H. A quiet and intimidating stranger who suddenly joins a Los Angeles armored truck company called Fortico Security. But from the moment H walks through the doors, there is something unusual about him, because he does not behave like a normal security guard, he does not seem interested in making friends, he does not talk about his past, and he appears far too calm whenever danger suddenly appears. And the movie immediately creates the feeling that H is hiding something much more serious than anyone around him realizes. Because when he arrives for his first day of work, his new colleagues expect him to be an inexperienced employee who will need time to learn the job. But nobody understands that H has entered Fortico for a very specific reason, and that reason is connected to a violent event that happened months earlier, an event that changed his life forever. And although the movie does not reveal everything immediately, it slowly gives us clues that H is not simply looking for employment. He is hunting someone. And every step he takes inside the company is part of a much larger plan. And this mystery becomes even more interesting because H's appearance does not match the level of danger hidden inside him. Because he looks like an ordinary middle-aged man. But when an armored truck is attacked during one of his early shifts, everyone suddenly discovers that H is anything but ordinary. And while the other guards panic as heavily armed criminals surround them, H remains strangely calm, studying the situation as if he has experienced something like this many times before. And when the attackers begin firing, H responds with unbelievable speed and precision, eliminating the threat almost single-handedly. And the surviving employees are stunned because they expected the new guy to be a liability. But instead, he has just demonstrated combat skills far beyond anything they have seen from a normal security guard. And this event immediately makes H a legend inside Fortico, with his colleagues giving him the nickname H and beginning to wonder where exactly he learned to fight like that. But H does not provide answers, and that silence only makes him more mysterious, because every time someone asks about his background, he avoids the subject. And this is where the movie begins revealing that there are actually multiple stories happening at the same time. Because while H is working as an armored truck guard in the present, another group of criminals is planning a massive robbery. And their plan is not based on luck or improvisation. It is based on detailed information about Fortico's routes, security procedures, schedules, and weaknesses. And this suggests that someone inside the company may be helping them. And the possibility of an inside connection makes the situation even more dangerous, because the armored trucks are carrying enormous amounts of cash, and anyone with access to the company's operations could potentially help criminals plan the perfect robbery. And H's arrival seems to complicate their plans because his skills are far beyond what they expected. And as he becomes more involved with the security team, he quietly studies his co-workers, paying attention to their behavior and looking for signs that someone may be connected to the criminal network. And this makes his character fascinating because he's not simply reacting to events, he is investigating them. And the audience gradually realizes that H already knows more than he is saying. And the reason he has joined Fortico is not because he needs a job, but because the company is connected to a target he has been searching for. And the movie deliberately keeps that target hidden for much of the early story, creating a sense of mystery around H's true identity. And this mystery becomes stronger when we see how differently H behaves during moments of danger compared with ordinary moments. Because during routine work, he remains quiet and almost emotionless. But the instant criminals appear, his personality changes completely, revealing the instincts of someone who has spent years living in violence. And his ability to remain calm under fire suggests that he has experience far beyond standard security work. And as H continues working, he develops a complicated relationship with his fellow guards, especially Bullet, a veteran employee who takes him under his wing and tries to understand the mysterious newcomer. And Bullet is fascinated by H's abilities because he has never seen a new employee adapt so quickly to dangerous situations. But H remains distant, and even when the others celebrate his achievements, he does not appear interested in attention, because his mind is focused on something else, something connected to revenge. And this is where Wrath of Man begins becoming more than a simple armored truck robbery movie, because the real story is about grief, anger, and the transformation of a man who has lost everything. And the title itself hints at the emotional journey, because H is not simply fighting criminals for money or professional pride. He is driven by an intense rage that has been building inside him. And the movie gradually reveals that this rage comes from the death of his son, who was killed during a robbery involving an armored truck. And that tragedy is the event that sets H's entire mission into motion. Because after losing his son, H becomes obsessed with finding the people responsible, and instead of trusting the authorities to solve the case, he decides to infiltrate the company connected to the crime, using his skills and resources to get close to the criminals himself. And this explains why he appears so emotionless, because his entire life has been reduced to one purpose: finding the people who took his son's life. And this also explains why he reacts so violently when criminals attack the trucks, because every robbery reminds him of the event that destroyed his family. And the movie slowly reveals that H's calm exterior is actually hiding enormous emotional pain. And this makes his character very different from the typical action hero, because he is not fighting because he enjoys violence. He is fighting because he believes violence is the only way he can achieve justice. And this creates a morally complicated character because his methods are ruthless, but his motivation comes from grief. And as H continues investigating Fortico, he begins identifying connections between the company's security procedures and the criminals who may have been responsible for his son's death. And his investigation brings him closer to a group of former military men who have their own plans for a massive robbery. And these men are not ordinary criminals either, because they are organized, disciplined, heavily armed, and capable of executing complex operations with military precision. And one of the key figures among them is Jackson, a former soldier who becomes involved in planning a major cash robbery, while another important figure is Jan, a man whose criminal activities eventually connect directly to H's personal revenge. And the movie uses these characters to create a second storyline that initially appears separate from H's journey. But as the story develops, the two narratives begin moving toward each other. And this structure is one of the film's most interesting features, because the audience is shown events from different points in time, slowly discovering how the characters are connected. And at first, H appears to be a mysterious newcomer entering an established world of criminals and security guards, but later we realize that he has been following these people for a long time, and his presence inside Fortico is part of a carefully calculated plan. And every time he responds to a robbery, he is not simply protecting the cash, he is collecting information, identifying suspects, and eliminating people who might be connected to his son's death. And this makes even the early action scenes more meaningful because we eventually understand that H is testing the people around him, watching how they react under pressure, and searching for clues about the organization responsible for the tragedy. And as his reputation grows inside Fortico, the criminals also begin hearing about him, and rumors spread that the company has a new guard who is extremely dangerous. And this creates a problem for the robbery team, because they cannot afford to underestimate him, yet they do not know who he really is. And H's anonymity becomes one of his greatest advantages, because while everyone else is trying to understand him, he is quietly studying them. And the tension increases when another armored truck robbery is attempted, because H once again demonstrates that he is capable of eliminating multiple attackers with frightening efficiency. And his performance confirms that he is not simply lucky, he is professionally trained. And this begins raising questions among his co-workers about his background. But H remains focused on the mission, and the more the movie reveals about his past, the more we understand why he has become so cold. Because losing his son has destroyed the normal life he once had, leaving revenge as the only thing that keeps him moving forward. And this obsession has transformed him into someone willing to enter dangerous situations without hesitation. And while the criminals believe they are planning the perfect robbery, H is quietly moving closer to them from inside their own security system. And this creates a dangerous game of cat and mouse, where both sides believe they are hunting the other. And eventually, the two stories begin to merge, as H's investigation leads him toward the people responsible for the robbery that killed his son. And he realizes that the criminals he has been searching for are closer than he imagined. And the deeper he goes, the more violent the conflict becomes. Because H is no longer interested in simply identifying the criminals, he wants them to pay. And his idea of justice is brutally personal. And this is what separates Wrath of Man from a traditional heist thriller. Because the central question is not whether the criminals will successfully steal the money, but whether H will finally find the people responsible for destroying his family. And as the tension builds, the audience begins to understand that the armored trucks, the robberies, the military team, and H's mysterious arrival at Fortico are all pieces of one much larger puzzle. And the closer those pieces come together, the more dangerous the situation becomes. Because when two groups of highly trained men with nothing left to lose finally collide, there is unlikely to be any peaceful ending. And H is already prepared for that reality, because unlike everyone else, he has been waiting for this moment for months. And now, the people responsible for his son's death are slowly moving into his sights, setting the stage for a brutal confrontation in which money becomes secondary and revenge becomes the only thing that matters. After H has already established himself as one of the most capable guards at Fortico, the story begins to move deeper into the hidden world surrounding the armored truck company. And this is where Wrath of Man starts revealing that the strange new employee is not simply protecting cash for a living, because every decision H makes appears to have another purpose behind it. And although his co-workers see him as a quiet and highly skilled guard, H is actually studying the company, its roots, its employees, its security procedures, and most importantly, the criminals who repeatedly attack the trucks. Because somewhere inside this dangerous system is the trail that leads back to the murder of his son. And the deeper H goes, the more he realizes that the robbery that destroyed his family was not an isolated crime, but part of a larger network involving people who understand Fortico's operations and know exactly when and where valuable shipments will be moving. And this makes the company itself feel almost like a battlefield waiting to explode, because every day the guards leave the depot carrying millions of dollars, they become potential targets, and every person with knowledge of their movements becomes a possible security risk. But H does not treat these dangers like ordinary problems, because he understands the criminal mindset from personal experience, and his ability to recognize patterns gives him an advantage that the other guards simply do not have. And this becomes obvious when the team receives another dangerous assignment, because while the other guards focus on completing the route and returning safely, H pays attention to everything around them, watching vehicles, people, intersections, and suspicious movements, almost as if he is expecting an attack before it happens. And when violence eventually erupts, H reacts with frightening speed, proving again that his calm personality is hiding years of combat experience. And this creates a strange mixture of admiration and suspicion among his colleagues, because they respect him for keeping them alive, but they also wonder where a man like H learned to shoot and fight with such precision. And Bullet, one of the more experienced Fortico employees, becomes particularly interested in him, treating H almost like a younger partner, despite the fact that H remains distant. And Bullet's friendly attitude provides one of the few moments of normality in H's otherwise dark life, because Bullet is not interested in H's secrets as much as he is interested in having a reliable partner on dangerous routes. But H cannot completely trust anyone, because his investigation has taught him that the criminal world is full of people who can appear harmless while secretly working for someone else. And this paranoia is understandable when we learn more about H's past, because before he became a security guard, he lived inside the criminal world himself, and he had built a reputation as a dangerous and highly influential figure, someone capable of commanding fear and respect from other criminals. But that life changed dramatically when his son was killed during an armored truck robbery, and the death of his child shattered the remaining connection between H and the life he had once accepted. Because before that tragedy, H could separate his criminal activities from his personal life, but after the murder, everything became personal. And instead of simply accepting that his son had become another victim of street violence, H decided to hunt the people responsible. And this decision eventually led him toward Fortico, where he believed the clues were hiding. And this is why H's employment is actually an elaborate infiltration, because he has no genuine interest in building a career in security. He is there because the armored truck company represents the path leading toward the criminals he needs to find. And every shift gives him another chance to gather information, and every robbery gives him another opportunity to see which criminals are involved. And this patient approach is important because H understands that revenge cannot be achieved through blind violence. He needs names, connections, roots, and evidence, and the audience begins to appreciate how intelligent he really is, because his greatest weapon is not his gun, it is his ability to remain patient while everyone else believes he is simply doing his job. And meanwhile, somewhere outside Fortico, another group is preparing a massive robbery. And their organization is very different from the random criminals H has encountered during earlier attacks, because these men operate with military discipline and many of them have backgrounds that allow them to plan a robbery like a tactical operation, with surveillance, communication, timing, weapons, escape routes, and contingency plans. And their objective is simple but extremely dangerous. They want to steal a huge amount of cash from Fortico, and they believe they have enough information to make the operation successful. But they do not realize that H has already entered their world from the opposite direction. And this creates the central tension of the movie, because the criminals are preparing to attack Fortico, while H is using Fortico to hunt criminals, meaning both sides are moving toward the same confrontation without fully understanding what awaits them. And as the criminals continue planning, the movie gives us more information about their personalities and motivations, showing that these men are not completely united by loyalty, because some are motivated by money, some by the desire to escape their old lives, and some by the thrill and power that comes with pulling off a dangerous operation. And this difference in motivation will eventually become important, because a criminal team can remain united only while everyone believes the plan is working. But once something goes wrong, fear begins destroying that unity, and H understands this better than anyone, because he has spent years around people whose loyalty disappears when survival becomes more important than friendship. And while the criminals are planning the biggest operation of their lives, H is quietly investigating another question: who inside the security system might be helping them, because the attacks are too precise to be random, and someone must have information about the routes and schedules. And H begins observing his co-workers more carefully, not because he wants to accuse innocent people, but because he knows that even a small piece of information can expose a much larger network. And this creates tension inside Fortico, because the guards themselves are unaware that they may be surrounded by hidden threats. And H's behavior becomes increasingly suspicious to those around him, because he seems to know when danger is coming, and when another robbery occurs, his performance once again shocks everyone, because he eliminates the attackers with a level of precision that seems almost impossible for an ordinary security guard. And after the incident, his co-workers begin treating him differently, with some seeing him as a hero and others becoming nervous around him, because nobody understands what kind of person they are working beside. And H does not correct their assumptions, because his secrecy is essential to his mission. And the audience begins seeing that H's isolation is not simply a personality trait. It is something he has chosen because emotional attachments can interfere with revenge. And although Bullet tries to bring him into the group, H remains careful, because he knows that if the criminals discover his real identity, anyone close to him could become a target. And this becomes especially important as the investigation moves forward and H begins connecting the current criminal operation with the robbery that killed his son. Because the more information he gathers, the clearer it becomes that the same world of organized criminals is responsible for multiple attacks, and the people planning the new robbery may include individuals connected to the old one, which means H's decision to infiltrate Fortico has finally begun producing results. And instead of searching blindly, he now has a path. But following that path means allowing the criminals to continue moving closer to their objective. And this creates a moral problem for H, because if he waits too long, innocent people could be killed. But if he acts too early, the criminals may disappear before he identifies the entire group. And H chooses patience, because he wants the entire network rather than one or two low-level attackers. And this decision shows how far he has changed since his son's death, because the man who once might have reacted emotionally now operates with calculated discipline, turning his grief into a strategic weapon. And as the criminals prepare for the major robbery, their confidence continues growing because they believe they understand Fortico's security weaknesses and have enough firepower to overwhelm the guards. But they have not accounted for H, and this is their greatest mistake, because H has already demonstrated that he can change the outcome of an attack almost single-handedly, and his presence makes every assumption in their plan more dangerous. And eventually, the criminals begin hearing stories about the mysterious Fortico guard, who appears almost impossible to kill. And these rumors create uncertainty within the group, because if the guard is really as dangerous as people claim, then their operation could be compromised. But they still do not understand why he is there. And that lack of information protects H, because they cannot recognize his connection to the past. And while they worry about the mysterious guard, H continues moving closer to them. And the movie begins shifting more heavily between present and past, showing the events that transformed him into the man we see now. And one of the most important elements of these flashbacks is the relationship between H and his son, because the boy represents the part of H's life that was untouched by the criminal world. And H's love for his son gives emotional meaning to everything that happens later, because without that relationship, his revenge would simply be another criminal feud. But with it, the story becomes about a father who has lost the person he wanted most to protect. And this loss also explains why H has become emotionally closed, because allowing himself to feel the grief would make it harder to continue. So he chooses anger instead, and anger becomes his armor, protecting him from the pain underneath. And this emotional transformation is one of the strongest elements of the movie, because H's greatest strength and greatest weakness are actually the same thing: his refusal to let go. And as he continues investigating, he discovers that the criminals are planning an operation large enough to expose several members of the network at once. And H realizes that this could be the opportunity he has been waiting for, because rather than chasing individual suspects across the city, he can allow them to come to him. And once they reveal themselves, he can follow the chain all the way to the people directly responsible for his son's death. And this is why H remains unusually calm when the danger increases, because unlike everyone else, he understands that the chaos may actually help him. And as the robbery team moves closer to execution, the atmosphere around Fortico becomes increasingly tense, with guards following routines that suddenly feel dangerous, vehicles moving through streets that seem exposed, and every ordinary cash transfer carrying the possibility of becoming a deadly ambush. And H knows that the attack is coming, but he does not know exactly how the criminals will approach it, so he continues studying their behavior. And when the moment finally arrives, the criminals attack with overwhelming force, attempting to take control of the armored truck and eliminate anyone who resists. But H responds almost instantly, turning the attack against them, and his actions confirm what the audience has suspected from the beginning. This is not a man who learned how to fight recently. This is someone who has spent years surviving violence, and the criminals suddenly find themselves facing a person who understands their tactics better than they understand his. And as the battle unfolds, H's objective becomes clearer. He is not simply trying to survive. He is searching for signs that these attackers are connected to the robbery that killed his son. And every movement, every weapon, and every face becomes another piece of evidence. And after the attack, the criminal team is forced to reconsider its assumptions, because their operation has encountered a level of resistance they never expected. And they begin asking questions about H, trying to discover who he is and why he seems so capable. But by the time they begin investigating him, H has already spent months investigating them, giving him a huge advantage. And this difference in preparation becomes one of the most important elements of the story, because the criminals are reacting to H while H is anticipating them. And the more they react, the more information they reveal. And eventually, the lines between the past and present become clearer, showing that H's son was not simply an unfortunate victim of random violence, but the victim of a specific criminal operation involving people who continued operating after the tragedy. And H's anger therefore becomes even more focused, because he now knows that the people responsible have continued living, making money, and planning new crimes while his family has been destroyed. And for H, that is unacceptable. And this realization pushes him closer to the point where he can no longer remain simply an observer. Because once he identifies the people he needs, the mission will shift from investigation to execution. And the criminals are unknowingly helping him reach that point with every step they take. And as the major robbery approaches, H begins preparing for the final confrontation, knowing that the criminals will eventually have to expose themselves completely. And once they do, there will be no reason for him to continue hiding, because the quiet guard will finally have an opportunity to become the man he has been all along. And the criminals will discover that the greatest threat to their operation was never the Fortico security system, never the police, and never the armored vehicles. It was the grieving father who entered their world with nothing left to lose. And as the tension reaches its highest point, H watches the criminals move closer to the robbery they believe will make them rich, unaware that their plan is also bringing them closer to the man who has been hunting them. And with every passing moment, the distance between H and his enemies becomes smaller, until the robbery is no longer simply a plan to steal money, but the final stage of a revenge mission that began with a child's death and has now grown into a war between a man seeking justice in his own brutal way and criminals who have no idea what kind of enemy they have created. The tension surrounding Fortico is now reaching a dangerous level, because while the criminals continue preparing what they believe will be the biggest and most profitable operation of their lives, H is quietly watching everything from inside the company. And what makes the situation so unpredictable is that neither side fully understands the other, because the criminals believe they have studied Fortico's security system well enough to control the robbery, while H knows that the information they have collected can only take them so far. And he also understands something they do not. The people preparing to attack Fortico are moving closer to the same criminal network that H has been hunting since the death of his son. And this means that the coming robbery could finally provide him with the answers he has been searching for. But before that happens, H must continue maintaining the appearance of an ordinary security guard, because revealing himself too early could destroy everything he has built. And this is becoming increasingly difficult because his performance during previous attacks has already made people suspicious, especially after he demonstrated an extraordinary ability to remain calm under pressure and eliminate armed attackers with almost unbelievable accuracy. And his co-workers begin asking themselves how a man who appears so quiet and ordinary could possess the skills of someone who has clearly spent years around violence. But H gives them nothing, because he understands that information is power, and the less his colleagues know about him, the safer his investigation remains. And one person who continues trying to understand him is Bullet, who has developed a strange but genuine respect for H, because Bullet recognizes that H is different from the other guards, but he does not yet understand why, and their relationship becomes one of the few human connections H allows himself to maintain. Although even this relationship remains limited by the secrets H carries. And this becomes important because Bullet represents the normal world that H has almost completely abandoned. A world where co-workers joke together, people go home after work, families wait for them, and tomorrow is expected to be another ordinary day, while H lives almost entirely in the past, because his mind keeps returning to the moment when his son was taken from him, and that memory has become the center of his identity. And the more we learn about H's past, the more we understand why he has become so emotionally distant. Because before the tragedy, he had been a powerful figure in the criminal underworld, someone who understood violence and had spent years building a reputation that made other criminals think twice before challenging him. But his son was different from everything else in his life, because the boy represented innocence, family, and the possibility that H could someday leave his criminal past behind. And when the boy was killed during an armored truck robbery, that possibility disappeared, leaving H with nothing except anger and a single question: who was responsible? And rather than trusting the authorities to solve the case, H decided to investigate the criminal world himself, using old connections, information networks, and his understanding of organized crime to follow the trail. And eventually, that trail led him toward Fortico, because the company was connected to the armored truck system and therefore to the criminals who knew how the routes worked. And H realized that if he wanted to find the people responsible, he needed to enter the system rather than attack it from the outside. Which is why he accepted the security job and began building his cover. And at first, this plan seems almost impossible, because H must spend months pretending to be someone he is not while working beside people who have no idea what he is really doing. But his patience allows him to succeed, and gradually he begins learning how Fortico operates, how the trucks are assigned, how the cash is transported, how guards communicate, and how criminals might exploit weaknesses in the system. And this knowledge also allows him to recognize when an attack is more sophisticated than it appears. And soon he notices that certain robberies are not simply attempts to steal cash, but appear to be carefully designed operations involving surveillance and detailed information, suggesting that the criminals have access to someone who understands Fortico's procedures, and this possibility becomes one of the most important elements of his investigation. Because if there is someone inside the company providing information, then H may be surrounded by people who are connected to the criminal network without knowing it, and he therefore begins paying attention to small details, looking for unusual behavior, unexplained movements, and connections between employees and outsiders. And rather than confronting anyone, he waits. Because H understands that criminals often expose themselves when they believe they are safe, and this patience allows him to gather information without revealing his true purpose. But outside Fortico, another group is preparing a completely different kind of operation, one that requires military-style discipline and planning. And this group is led by men who understand tactics, weapons, surveillance, and coordinated movement. And unlike ordinary street criminals who might make decisions impulsively, these men approach the robbery like a mission, studying Fortico's routes, calculating response times, identifying weak points, and preparing escape strategies. And they believe that with enough preparation, they can control every stage of the operation. But their confidence is based on one dangerous assumption. They believe the security guards will react like normal security guards. And they have no idea that one of those guards is actually a highly experienced criminal who understands exactly how people like them think. And this creates a hidden battle of intelligence, because the criminals are studying Fortico while H is studying them, and each side believes it is gaining the advantage. But H has the benefit of patience because he does not need to rush, and the criminals have a deadline because their operation must eventually happen. And as they continue planning, they become increasingly confident that the armored truck system has weaknesses they can exploit. And their confidence grows when they discover information about routes, schedules, and security procedures. But H begins to suspect that someone may be feeding them that information, and this possibility forces him to expand his investigation, because the robbery that killed his son may have involved the same kind of insider knowledge. And if that is true, then the criminals he is hunting may still be operating through the same system, meaning his decision to join Fortico was exactly the right move. And while H investigates, the criminals begin testing their own assumptions by carrying out smaller attacks and observing how Fortico responds. and each test gives them more information. But it also gives H more information about them because he watches the way they operate, the equipment they use, the timing of their attacks, and the level of discipline they demonstrate. And he quickly realizes that the upcoming operation will be far more dangerous than anything the guards have faced before. And this knowledge changes the way he prepares, because H knows that when the major robbery happens, he may have only seconds to determine who is involved, and one mistake could cost the lives of his co-workers or innocent civilians. But despite the danger, H does not back away, because he believes the operation could finally expose the men connected to his son's murder. And this is where his revenge becomes morally complicated, because if H acts too early, he may save lives but lose the opportunity to reach the people he really wants. While if he waits, he risks allowing violence to happen around him. And H chooses the second option, accepting the danger because he believes the larger objective is more important. And this decision shows just how deeply grief has changed him, because a normal security guard would think first about protecting everyone and stopping the robbery, while H is thinking about the larger criminal network and the possibility of finally reaching the people responsible for his personal tragedy. And this makes him neither a traditional hero nor a simple villain, but a man whose sense of justice has become completely personal. And as the criminals continue preparing, the film begins showing more of the relationships inside their group, and it becomes clear that their unity is partly based on shared history, because some of them served together and developed trust through dangerous experiences. But money is still the ultimate motivation for the operation, and this means their loyalty has limits, because once the robbery begins going wrong, each man will have to decide whether he values the group or his own survival. And H understands this weakness because he has spent years around criminals, and he knows that the strongest organizations can collapse quickly when fear enters the picture. And this knowledge gives him another advantage, because he does not need to defeat the entire group at once. He only needs to create enough pressure for them to begin making mistakes, and the more mistakes they make, the more information H will receive. And as the day of the major robbery approaches, the atmosphere at Fortico becomes increasingly tense, even though most employees do not realize why, and the guards continue performing their routines, checking vehicles, loading cash, and preparing for routes, while H watches them with a level of attention that seems almost unnatural. And Bullet continues to treat him like a trusted partner, but H remains emotionally distant, because he knows that if the criminals discover his real identity, everyone around him could become a target. And this is another reason why H avoids discussing his past, because his history is not simply a personal secret. It is a dangerous weapon that could be turned against him. And the criminals outside Fortico also begin hearing rumors about the security guard who has repeatedly disrupted their operations. And some of them start wondering whether H is simply an unusually talented employee or something much more serious. But they do not yet have enough information to connect him to the past. And this protects him for the moment, because they are looking at H from the wrong direction, trying to understand why he is so skilled instead of asking why he joined Fortico in the first place. And the answer to that question would expose the entire revenge plan, and eventually the criminals finalize their preparations for the major robbery, gathering weapons, vehicles, disguises, and equipment, and they begin rehearsing the operation in their minds, believing that once they reach Fortico, everything will happen according to plan, and they have good reason to be confident because they have studied the company carefully. But their plan contains one variable they cannot control, H, and H has already anticipated many of the possibilities they are preparing for, because his understanding of armored truck robberies comes from both sides of the conflict. He knows how security guards think, and he knows how criminals think, giving him a perspective that neither side of the operation fully possesses. And this dual understanding is what makes him so dangerous, because he can predict what criminals expect security guards to do and then choose something completely different. And as the operation finally begins moving towards reality, H becomes increasingly focused because he knows that once the criminals attack, he may finally see the faces he has been searching for. And the memory of his son becomes stronger. Not because H wants to feel pain, but because the memory reminds him why he is willing to risk everything. And the film uses these moments to deepen the emotional connection between H and his mission, showing that beneath his controlled exterior is a father who has never accepted the loss. And this is why his anger never disappears. Because accepting the loss would mean accepting that the people responsible might escape without consequences, and H refuses to allow that, even if his refusal destroys what remains of his own life. And when the criminals finally make their move, the situation changes almost instantly, because what begins as a carefully coordinated attack quickly becomes a violent confrontation, and H reacts with the speed and precision that have made him a mystery inside Fortico, immediately taking control of the situation and demonstrating that the criminals have seriously underestimated their opponent. And the guards around him are shocked by the transformation because the quiet employee they knew suddenly moves like someone who has spent his entire life preparing for combat. And the attackers also realize that something is wrong, because this is not the normal resistance they expected, and H's response forces them to change their plan. But the more they change their plan, the more they reveal about themselves, and H watches carefully, searching for familiar faces and identifying patterns connected to the earlier robbery. And this is the moment when his professional mission and personal revenge begin to merge completely, because every criminal he encounters could potentially be connected to the men who killed his son. And he knows that if he survives the attack, he may finally have enough information to continue the hunt. But survival is not his only concern, because he wants the people behind the operation. And that means he cannot simply destroy everyone and walk away. He needs to understand who is giving orders, who is providing information, and who was present during the robbery that took his son's life. And this forces H to make decisions under extreme pressure, because the criminals are attacking with overwhelming force while he is trying to identify the structure behind them. And the situation becomes even more complicated when the attackers realize that H is far more dangerous than expected, causing panic to spread through their ranks. And once panic begins, the disciplined operation starts showing weaknesses, because communication becomes less effective, people make emotional decisions, and escape plans begin changing. And H uses this confusion to his advantage, moving carefully through the violence and continuing his search for the people he believes are connected to his past. And the more he sees, the more certain he becomes that the criminal network he has been investigating is much larger than one robbery crew. And this realization makes his mission even more dangerous, because he is no longer hunting a small group of thieves. He is stepping into a criminal organization with resources, connections, and people who are capable of planning major operations. But H has already crossed the point where turning back is possible, because he has spent too much time and sacrificed too much to abandon the mission now. And his son's memory has become the reason he continues moving forward even when the logical choice would be to retreat. And as the robbery develops, H's presence creates chaos among the criminals, because their expectations have been destroyed, and the man they thought would be an ordinary guard has become the greatest obstacle to their escape. And this begins exposing the difference between H and the people he is hunting, because the criminals are fighting for money and survival, while H is fighting because he believes there is a debt that must be paid, and that makes him willing to take risks they would never consider. And as the criminals attempt to regroup and continue their operation, H realizes that the major robbery could be even more valuable than he expected, because the people involved may include some of the same individuals who were connected to his son's murder. And if he can follow the chain from the current operation back to the original crime, he may finally reach the person at the center of everything. And this possibility changes his entire strategy. Because now he is not simply reacting to the attack, he is allowing certain movements to happen so that the criminals reveal themselves. And the audience begins to understand just how far ahead H has been thinking. Because his decision to join Fortico was never simply about gaining access to information. It was about creating the perfect position from which he could watch the criminal network expose itself. And now that the criminals have stepped into the open, H's patience is beginning to pay off. But the danger is also increasing, because the more information he gains, the more likely it becomes that someone will recognize him. And once his real identity is exposed, there will be no safety left for him or anyone connected to him. And this possibility becomes particularly important as the criminals begin asking questions about the mysterious Fortico guard. Because rumors about H's abilities are spreading, and eventually someone will begin connecting those abilities to the man he used to be. And if that happens, the entire operation will change, because the criminals will no longer be dealing with an unknown security guard. They will be dealing with a man from their own world who has returned with a personal reason to destroy them. And as the robbery reaches a more dangerous stage, H continues moving toward that inevitable confrontation, and the memory of his son becomes the emotional force behind every decision, reminding him that the purpose of this entire operation is not money, not revenge for reputation, and not even justice in the legal sense, but the desire of a father to make the people responsible for his child's death answer for what they did. And this is where Wrath of Man becomes much more than a straightforward action movie, because the violence is constantly connected to grief. And H's extraordinary abilities are presented as the result of a life that has been shaped by violence, while his silence represents the emotional damage caused by losing someone he could never replace. And as the criminals begin escaping with their objective, H understands that the battle is not finished, because the money may move, the vehicles may disappear, and the criminals may scatter. But the information he has gained is enough to continue the hunt, and he now knows that the people he has been looking for are closer than ever, and the next stage of his plan will be even more dangerous, because he will have to move beyond Fortico's walls and directly into the criminal world that once defined his life. And this means confronting people who may know his old identity, people who understand his methods, and people who may be just as ruthless as he is. And yet, H does not hesitate, because after everything he has lost, fear is no longer enough to stop him. And the robbery has accomplished something the criminals never intended. It has brought H closer to the truth. And as the dust begins to settle, the audience is left with the realization that the largest conflict in the movie has not even reached its final stage, because the robbery was only the beginning of the real war, and H is now closer than ever to discovering who truly stood behind the events that killed his son, while the criminals are slowly beginning to realize that the man they thought was simply guarding their money may actually be the man who has been hunting them from the shadows. And once they understand that truth, there will be no going back, because H's disguise is beginning to crack, the criminal network is beginning to recognize the threat, and the revenge that started with a grieving father is now moving toward a final confrontation in which money, loyalty, survival, and personal vengeance will all collide. The situation has now changed completely, because H is no longer simply investigating a series of armored truck robberies from inside Fortico. He is beginning to understand the larger organization behind them, and every new piece of information brings him closer to the people connected to the death of his son. But at the same time, the criminals are becoming increasingly aware that someone inside Fortico is far more dangerous than they originally believed, and this creates a silent war between H and the men hunting the company's money. A war based on information, patience, and deception, because H knows that if he reveals too much of himself too early, the criminals will disappear. But if he waits too long, innocent people could be caught in the violence, and this balance becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as the criminals prepare for their most ambitious operation yet, an operation designed to target Fortico at a time when the company will be carrying an enormous amount of cash. And unlike the smaller robberies that came before it, this plan requires military-level coordination, because the criminals understand that attacking an armored truck is one thing, but attacking a heavily protected cash depot and escaping with a huge amount of money is something completely different, and their preparation shows just how serious they are, because they study the building, the vehicles, the security guards, the timing of cash movements, and the possible police response, while H is quietly doing the same thing from the opposite side. And what makes H particularly dangerous is that he understands both worlds, because he knows how security systems are designed and he knows how criminals try to defeat them, and this allows him to anticipate the attacker's thinking in ways that ordinary guards cannot. But H is not interested in stopping the robbery simply because it is his job, because his real objective remains finding the people responsible for his son's death, and this means he needs to understand exactly who is involved, who gives the orders, who provides information, and who was connected to the earlier robbery. And the more he investigates, the more he realizes that the criminals are connected through old relationships and shared history, with some of them having served together and others having worked in organized crime for years. And this makes the group dangerous because they understand discipline, weapons, surveillance, and teamwork. But it also creates a weakness, because their loyalty is ultimately based on money and survival, and when those things disappear, the unity can collapse very quickly. And H knows this because he spent years in the same world, and he understands that people who appear loyal when millions of dollars are on the table can become completely different when they realize they might die. And this understanding becomes important as the robbery begins, moving from preparation into execution, because the criminals have convinced themselves that they control the situation. But H is already waiting for them, and while his co-workers continue performing their normal duties, H watches the environment carefully, recognizing that the atmosphere is different, and when the attack begins, the criminals move quickly, using overwhelming force to create confusion and control the area. But H responds with the same frightening precision that has made him such a mystery to everyone at Fortico, and the difference between him and the attackers becomes immediately obvious, because while they are following a plan, H is reacting to reality, and reality is constantly changing, forcing the criminals to improvise, while H remains calm, because chaos is exactly the kind of environment in which his experience gives him an advantage. And the attack becomes a violent struggle in which Fortico's security system is pushed to its limits, but H is not thinking about the money. He is watching the criminals, studying their faces, their weapons, their movements, and their communication, trying to identify connections to the past. And this creates an unusual tension because the audience understands that H could potentially end the confrontation quickly, but he is searching for something more valuable than victory. He is searching for information, and this is one of the most important differences between H and a conventional action hero, because he is not simply trying to defeat the villains in front of him. He is trying to understand the entire structure behind them, and that requires him to remain patient even when violence surrounds him. And as the robbery continues, the criminals discover that their carefully prepared operation is beginning to break apart, because H's presence has introduced a variable they never anticipated, and their communications become more desperate, their movements less coordinated, and their confidence begins disappearing. And this is exactly what H wanted, because fear causes people to make mistakes, and every mistake gives him another clue. And eventually, the criminals realize that the security guard they underestimated is not simply talented. He is operating with the experience of someone who has spent years inside dangerous criminal organizations, and this realization begins changing the way they see him, because now they are no longer dealing with an unknown employee. They are dealing with a possible enemy who understands their methods, and the possibility that H may be connected to the criminal world begins creating anxiety among the group, but they still do not know the full truth, because they cannot imagine that the man standing in front of them is actually connected to the robbery that began this entire chain of events. And while they struggle to understand H, he continues moving toward the people he believes are responsible, and the memory of his son becomes increasingly important because H's actions are no longer simply professional decisions. They are decisions made by a father who has spent years refusing to accept that his child died for nothing, and the film repeatedly contrasts H's cold exterior with the emotional wound underneath it, showing that his kindness is not the absence of emotion, but the result of emotion that has been buried so deeply that it has become part of his identity. And this is why H rarely speaks about his personal life, because there is almost nothing left in that life except the memory of his son, and every time the memory returns, his anger becomes stronger. And that anger has given him the determination to enter situations that most people would consider suicidal, because H no longer values his own safety in the same way that ordinary people do. And this makes him extremely difficult to predict, because criminals usually calculate risk according to what they might lose, but H has already lost the person who mattered most, so threats that would stop another man do not necessarily stop him, and this is something the criminals slowly begin to understand. But understanding it does not necessarily help them, because by the time they realize how dangerous H is, he has already gathered enough information to continue the investigation, and after the immediate danger passes, H begins tracing the remaining connections, following clues that lead him deeper into the criminal world. And this is where his past becomes increasingly important, because H is simply investigating criminals from the outside. He knows many of the same methods they use, and he understands how criminal organizations hide their money, how they communicate, and how they protect the people at the top. And this knowledge allows him to move through their world with a confidence that would be impossible for an ordinary security guard. But it also means that H is returning to the life he once abandoned, and every step deeper into that world risks bringing back the person he used to be, the violent man who had once built a reputation through fear. And this creates an internal conflict because H wants to use his old skills to achieve justice, but the more he uses those skills, the more he becomes the same kind of violent figure he once wanted to leave behind. And the movie does not provide an easy answer to that conflict. Instead, it allows H to become increasingly consumed by his mission, and as his investigation continues, he begins narrowing down the people connected to the robbery that killed his son. And eventually, he discovers that the crime involved a group whose members have continued committing robberies and operating together, meaning the tragedy that destroyed H's family was simply another event in a much larger criminal history. And this discovery makes his anger even stronger, because while he has spent years carrying the memory of his son, the people responsible have continued living their lives, making money, planning crimes, and forgetting the innocent people they left behind. And for H, that is impossible to accept, and this is why he does not want to simply expose them to the authorities, because he believes the legal system cannot provide the kind of justice he wants, and instead he chooses to confront the criminals directly, knowing that doing so will likely require him to cross moral and legal boundaries. And this decision defines the darker side of his character, because H is willing to become a violent force in order to destroy other violent people. And although the audience understands his pain, the film never suggests that his path is clean or heroic, because every step toward revenge takes him further away from the possibility of a normal life. And meanwhile, the criminals themselves are becoming more ambitious, because the success of their earlier operations has convinced them that the major Fortico robbery can succeed, and they begin finalizing the details, preparing vehicles, weapons, disguises, and escape routes. And they believe they have solved the problem of Fortico security, but they still have not solved the problem of H. and this is because they continue to think of him as part of the security system, instead of realizing that he has his own agenda. And once the major robbery is set into motion, H decides that the time for observation is almost over because the criminals are finally gathering enough people in one place for him to identify the connections he needs, and he knows that if he waits until everything is finished, some of them may escape, but if he moves at the right moment, he can turn the criminals' own operation against them, and this is where H's strategic intelligence becomes just as important as his physical abilities, because he knows that a successful revenge mission requires more than shooting everyone in sight. It requires controlling the environment, controlling information, and controlling when the enemy realizes what is happening. And H has spent months creating exactly that advantage. And as the criminals begin their final preparations, one of the most important themes of the movie becomes clear: the difference between greed and revenge. Because the criminals are risking their lives to obtain money they do not need, while H is risking his life to punish people for a loss that money cannot repair. And these two motivations eventually collide in the same place, and when they do, the result is inevitable because neither side is willing to stop. But H's motivation is stronger in one crucial way. He is not trying to gain something, he is trying to settle something, and that makes him more willing to sacrifice everything. And as the day of the major operation arrives, Fortico becomes increasingly vulnerable because enormous amounts of cash are moving through the system, and the criminals position themselves according to the plan they have spent so long developing, believing that their preparation has eliminated every major risk. And H is there as well, appearing calm, but inside he understands that this may be the moment he has been waiting for since his son's death, and the memory of that terrible day returns in fragments, reminding him of what started everything. And these memories also reveal the tragedy of H's character, because his son was not part of his criminal life. The boy was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, and H has spent years blaming himself for being unable to protect him, and this guilt becomes one of the hidden forces behind his revenge, because somewhere inside H is the belief that if he had been a different man, perhaps his son would still be alive. And now he cannot change the past, so he chooses to punish the people who caused it. And this makes his revenge both personal and self-destructive, because no matter how many criminals he eliminates, he can never erase his own guilt. And as the robbery begins, the criminals move according to their carefully rehearsed plan. But the moment they encounter serious resistance, everything starts changing, and H's presence forces them to adapt. And once they begin adapting, their original plan starts breaking apart, because every change creates another weakness, and H exploits those weaknesses with ruthless efficiency. And the violence becomes increasingly intense, but H remains focused on the people who matter most to his mission, refusing to become distracted by the money or by the chaos around him. And eventually, he begins identifying individuals who may be connected to the original robbery. And this is where the story's past and present finally begin moving toward each other, because the men involved in the current operation are not simply criminals H happens to encounter. They are connected to the chain of events that killed his son. And H realizes that the opportunity he has been waiting for has finally arrived. But the criminals also begin realizing that something is deeply wrong, because the man they believed was simply defending Fortico is behaving like someone who has a personal reason to be there, and they begin questioning who H really is. And as their suspicion grows, the danger increases, because if they identify him before he completes his mission, they will have every reason to eliminate him immediately, and H understands this, which is why he moves quickly but carefully, trying to stay ahead of their realization. And the more the criminals panic, the more mistakes they make. And the more mistakes they make, the closer H gets to the people he wants. And this creates a chain reaction in which the criminals effectively destroy their own security through fear. And the group that once appeared disciplined begins turning into a collection of desperate men trying to survive. And this is exactly the weakness H expected, because no amount of planning can completely prepare people for a situation in which the rules have changed. And H has changed the rules, because he is no longer playing the role they expected him to play. And once that truth becomes clear, the balance of power shifts dramatically and the robbery becomes something completely different from what the criminals planned. Because instead of simply stealing money and escaping, they are now fighting for survival against an enemy who has been preparing for them long before they knew his name. And H continues following the trail, moving closer to the individuals who hold the answers to his past. And with every step he takes, the emotional weight becomes heavier because the closer he gets to revenge, the closer he also gets to confronting the reality that revenge cannot bring his son back. And yet he continues because he has spent too much of his life pursuing this moment to stop now. And perhaps the most tragic part of H's journey is that he has allowed revenge to become the only reason he wakes up each morning. And once that revenge is complete, he may have nothing left to hold on to. But that thought does not stop him, because H has already sacrificed his future for the past, and the only thing that matters now is reaching the end. And as the criminals attempt to escape with the money, H follows the trail knowing that the operation has exposed more of their network than they intended, and he now has enough information to identify the people most directly connected to the tragedy. But the final confrontation will require him to leave behind the controlled environment of Fortico and return fully to the criminal world he once knew, and that means facing people who may recognize his reputation, people who understand his methods, and people who know exactly how dangerous he can be. And H is prepared for that because he has been preparing for it since the day his son died. And the movie now moves toward its final stage, where the mystery surrounding H will finally be completely exposed, and the criminals will understand that their biggest mistake was not planning the robbery poorly, but creating a situation that brought them directly into the path of a man who had nothing left to lose. And as the dust settles around the Fortico operation, H realizes that he is closer than ever to the people he has been hunting, but he also knows that the most dangerous part of his mission is still ahead, because finding the criminals is one thing, confronting them is another. And once he begins that confrontation, there will be no possibility of returning to the quiet life of a security guard, because the identity he has hidden for so long will finally come into the open, and the man responsible for his son's death will discover that the mysterious guard inside Fortico was never there to protect their money. He was there to find them, and now that he has finally found the trail, H is ready to follow it all the way to the end, even if reaching that end means destroying whatever remains of the man he used to be. The carefully planned robbery has now pushed every character toward the point of no return, and for H, the chaos surrounding Fortico is no longer simply another dangerous situation, because the events unfolding around him are finally connecting the present to the tragedy that has controlled his life for years. And as the criminals begin moving through the final stages of their operation, H understands that the men he has been searching for are no longer distant names hidden somewhere inside an enormous criminal network. They are directly within his reach. And that realization changes the atmosphere completely, because H has spent so long preparing for this moment that he knows exactly what he must do. But he also understands that once he begins, there will be no way to return to the quiet identity he created inside Fortico, and the mysterious security guard will finally disappear, revealing the man who has been hiding underneath the uniform all along. A man shaped by violence, loss, and an obsession with revenge that has consumed nearly every part of his life. And this is where the movie's non-linear storytelling becomes especially important, because the audience has already seen pieces of H's past, but only now do those pieces begin fitting together, revealing that his arrival at Fortico was never accidental, his unusual skills were never simply the result of professional training, and his strange interest in the company's robberies was never ordinary curiosity, because everything has been connected to one event, the death of his son. And the deeper H moves into the criminal network, the clearer it becomes that the robbery responsible for that death involved people who have continued operating long after the tragedy. And while H has spent years carrying the memory of his son, the criminals responsible have continued living, making money, and planning new crimes. And that difference is what drives H's anger, because to him, their ability to continue living normally represents the ultimate injustice. And H has convinced himself that the only way to balance that injustice is through revenge. And now, the opportunity has finally arrived, because the criminals have gathered together for an operation large enough to expose their connections, and H is in exactly the position he needs to be in, close enough to observe them and powerful enough to stop them. And yet, there is another layer to the situation, because the criminals are not simply random thieves, they are organized, disciplined and experienced, and many of them have backgrounds that make them extremely dangerous, which means H cannot underestimate them even though he has been preparing for this confrontation for months, and the men responsible for planning the operation believe they have accounted for every major threat, from police response to Fortico security. But they have not accounted for a man whose motivation cannot be measured by money, and that is their biggest mistake, because the criminals are risking their lives to become wealthy, while H is risking his life because wealth has become meaningless to him, and this difference makes H far more dangerous than any ordinary security guard. Because the criminals are constantly calculating what they can lose, while H has already experienced the loss that mattered most to him, and that allows him to move through danger with a level of determination that frightens even experienced criminals. And as the operation becomes increasingly violent, the criminals begin realizing that the plan is no longer under their control, because every unexpected resistance forces them to change their strategy, and every change creates another weakness. And H is constantly watching those weaknesses, using the confusion to identify the people who matter most. And this is where his patience begins paying off, because rather than wasting energy fighting every criminal equally, he focuses on tracing the chain of command and discovering who is connected to the events that killed his son. And the more he learns, the more obvious it becomes that the robbery was part of a larger network in which information, money, and violence were exchanged between people who trusted each other only as long as the system worked. And H understands that kind of loyalty because he once lived inside the same world, and he knows that when survival becomes more important than friendship, even the strongest alliances can collapse. And that collapse begins happening as the robbery becomes more chaotic, because some criminals start worrying about escaping while others remain focused on completing the mission, and their priorities begin separating them, making the group less effective. And H uses that division to his advantage, because he does not need to fight an organized unit if he can force that unit to become a collection of frightened individuals. And this is one of the reasons his approach is so effective, because H understands that violence is not only about physical strength, it is also about psychological control. And once the criminals realize that they may not survive, their own fear becomes a weapon against them. And H remains almost completely silent during these moments, because he does not need to explain himself. His actions communicate everything. And the contrast between his silence and the criminal's panic makes the situation even more intense, because H appears almost emotionless while everyone around him is losing control. But the audience understands that beneath that calm exterior is a father remembering the worst day of his life, and that memory gives his actions their emotional meaning, because H is not simply trying to survive a robbery. He is trying to finish a mission that began when his son was murdered. And this is why the money being stolen around him has almost no importance, because even millions of dollars cannot compensate for the loss he suffered. And that is also why H's character feels different from the other criminals in the story, because everyone else has something they want: money, power, freedom, reputation, or survival, while H wants something that cannot actually be recovered. And because his goal is impossible in the deepest sense, he has turned his attention toward punishment instead, convincing himself that if he can make the people responsible suffer, then at least his son's death will not remain unanswered. And this belief drives him further into violence. And as the operation continues, H begins closing the distance between himself and the individuals connected to his past, and the criminals slowly begin discovering pieces of information about the mysterious Fortico guard, realizing that his abilities cannot be explained by an ordinary security background. And suspicion begins spreading through the group, with questions about who H really is and why he seems so prepared for everything they do. But by the time they start asking those questions, H has already been studying them for months, and this gives him a decisive advantage because he knows more about them than they know about him. And once the criminals begin investigating his identity, they discover that the man inside Fortico may have a history far more dangerous than they expected. And this creates a moment where the past and present finally collide, because H is forced to confront the criminal world he once belonged to. And the people inside that world begin realizing that the quiet security guard may actually be someone they should have feared long before he ever walked through the doors of Fortico. And this revelation changes the emotional meaning of the entire story, because H's journey is not simply about becoming a powerful action hero. It is about returning to the violent identity he once abandoned, because tragedy has convinced him that violence is the only language his enemies understand. And the more he uses his old skills, the harder it becomes to imagine him returning to an ordinary life. And this is one of the movie's most important themes, because revenge can give someone a purpose while simultaneously destroying every possibility of happiness beyond that purpose. And H has already sacrificed his future because he cannot release his past. And now that the end is approaching, the audience can see the cause of that decision, because even if he succeeds, his son will remain dead, his family will not be restored, and the years he spent hunting criminals will never come back. And this means the final victory can never truly be a happy one. And perhaps H understands that better than anyone, which is why he never shows excitement about what he is doing. Because he is not expecting happiness at the end, he is expecting completion. And completion is all he has left. And as the criminals attempt to complete their operation, the situation becomes increasingly desperate, because their carefully planned escape routes begin disappearing, and their ability to control events becomes weaker with every passing minute. And H continues moving through the chaos with ruthless efficiency, eliminating threats and following the trail toward the men he needs. And the action becomes increasingly brutal, but the violence is always connected to the emotional story, because every confrontation brings H closer to the people responsible for his son's death. And this gives the action a sense of inevitability, as though everything that has happened since the opening of the movie has been moving toward one final collision. And the audience begins to understand why H was willing to spend so long inside Fortico, because he knew that eventually the criminals would expose themselves, and now they have. And once H has identified the people connected to the past, the question is no longer whether he can find them. It is whether he can survive the confrontation that follows. And this is where the film begins shifting from investigation into revenge, because H no longer needs to hide his purpose, and the criminals no longer have the protection of anonymity, and the two sides are finally looking directly at each other. And H's calmness becomes even more unsettling, because he does not behave like a man who is angry in the traditional sense. He does not scream, he does not lose control, and he does not allow emotion to interfere with his actions. Instead, his anger has become so deeply embedded in his personality that it appears as discipline. And that makes him more dangerous, because he is not acting impulsively. He has thought about this moment countless times, and he has already accepted the consequences. And the criminals begin realizing that they cannot bargain with him, because money is not going to change his mind, and threats will not scare him, and promises cannot undo the past. and this leaves them with only one option: fighting. But fighting H is exactly what they should have avoided, because he understands their methods, their weapons, and their mentality, and every attempt they make to escape simply gives him another opportunity to close the distance. And as the final stages of the conflict approach, H's past is revealed even more clearly, showing that before the tragedy he had been a powerful figure in the criminal world, a man whose reputation alone could intimidate others. But the death of his son transformed that power into something much darker, because he stopped using violence to gain wealth or influence, and began using it to pursue personal justice. And this transformation is the emotional heart of the movie. Because H is no longer interested in becoming more powerful, he is interested in destroying the people who caused his loss. And that distinction explains why he behaves differently from everyone else. And while the criminals continue thinking about money, H thinks about a face from his past, the face of his son, and the memory of that loss is the only thing keeping him moving forward. And as the final confrontation draws closer, H finally reaches the people he has been hunting, and the tension becomes almost unbearable because there is no longer any distance between the past and present. And the men who once believed their crime was finished are suddenly facing the consequences of what they did years earlier. And H stands before them not as a security guard, but as the father of the child whose death they caused. And this moment gives the story its emotional weight, because the criminals are forced to understand that the violence they once treated as another part of their criminal lifestyle had consequences that followed them for years. And H has become that consequence. And when the final confrontation begins, there is no need for a long explanation, because the history between them speaks through every movement. And H's determination is absolute, while the criminals are driven by fear and desperation. And that difference determines the outcome, because H is willing to risk everything, while they are desperately trying to preserve what they have. And the movie continues showing how greed can destroy loyalty, because when people realize they may lose their lives, the money that once united them becomes meaningless, and some begin thinking only about escape, while others attempt to protect themselves. And H takes advantage of this breakdown, moving toward his final objective, while the criminal organization collapses around him. And this creates a powerful contrast with the beginning of the operation, when the criminals appeared disciplined and almost unstoppable, because now they are scattered, frightened, and uncertain, while H remains focused, proving that preparation and motivation can be more powerful than numbers. And eventually, the conflict reaches the point where H can no longer remain hidden, and the identity he created at Fortico is completely destroyed, because everyone involved now understands that he was never there simply to guard cash. And this revelation changes the meaning of every earlier scene, because every conversation, every route, every robbery, and every suspicious moment was part of a larger plan. And H's entire presence inside Fortico was designed to bring him closer to the people responsible for his son's death. And now that plan has succeeded. But success comes with a terrible price, because H has spent so much of his life preparing for revenge that he has almost nothing left beyond it. And the possibility of finally achieving his goal therefore carries an unexpected sadness, because once the final target is gone, the mission that has given H purpose will also disappear. And the question becomes, what kind of man will remain after the anger is finished? And the movie deliberately refuses to answer that question in a comforting way, because H has already been changed permanently by his loss, and no act of revenge can return him to the person he was before his son died. And this is why the final confrontation feels more like the end of a long tragedy than the victory of a traditional hero, because H may succeed in punishing the people responsible, but he cannot undo the past, and the audience is left to understand that revenge has given him direction but not peace. And as the final stage of the operation unfolds, H moves closer to completing everything he started, while the criminals discover that the greatest threat they faced was never the police or Fortico's security system. It was the man who entered their world with nothing left to lose. And the final pieces of the story now begin falling into place, revealing the full chain of events that connected the robbery, the death of H's son, the criminal network, and his infiltration of Fortico. And once that chain is complete, there will be only one thing left for H to do: face the person most responsible and settle the score. But the closer he gets to that moment, the more obvious it becomes that this is not really a story about winning, because H has already lost the person he was trying to protect, and no amount of violence can change that. And perhaps that is the tragedy at the center of Wrath of Man. A man can become strong enough to defeat almost anyone, but strength cannot defeat grief. And H's entire journey has been an attempt to transform grief into something he can control. And revenge is the only form he has found. And now, with his enemies finally within reach, that revenge is about to reach its final and most dangerous stage, where H will have to decide whether completing the mission is worth whatever remains of his life, even though he has already made that decision long ago. Because from the moment his son died, H stopped living for the future and began living for one final purpose. And that purpose is now standing directly in front of him. The final stage of H's mission begins when the truth can no longer remain hidden, because after spending so much time inside Fortico, studying the armored truck routes, watching the guards, following the criminals, and patiently connecting the events of the present to the robbery that destroyed his family, H has finally reached the people he has been hunting. And at this point, the mysterious security guard is no longer simply an employee carrying a weapon and protecting money, because the mask has effectively disappeared and the man standing before his enemies is the same man who once operated inside the criminal underworld with a reputation powerful enough to make experienced criminals afraid. But there is one major difference between the man he used to be and the man standing here now. Because in the past, H was motivated by power, money, influence, and the criminal world itself, while now he is motivated by grief, and that grief has transformed into a cold determination to punish the people who took his son away. And this is why the final confrontation feels different from every earlier action sequence in the movie. Because the audience now understands that H has not been fighting for Fortico, he has not been fighting for the money, and he has not even been fighting simply to survive. He has been fighting to reach this exact moment, and when the people responsible finally realize who he is, the shock is almost as important as the violence itself, because they suddenly understand that the quiet guard they ignored was never an ordinary employee. He was a man who had entered their world deliberately, and every robbery, every security route, every conversation, and every dangerous shift had been part of a larger plan. And now there is no longer any reason for H to pretend, because the people he came for are standing directly in front of him. And the criminals quickly discover that there is no negotiation that can save them, because H is not interested in money and he is not interested in promises, and nothing they can offer can bring his son back. So the only thing left between H and his final objective is violence. And as the confrontation develops, the movie brings together the two worlds that have existed separately throughout the story, the world of Fortico and the world of organized crime, and H stands between them, carrying the experience of both, because he understands the security system from the inside and the criminal mindset from the outside. And this makes him almost impossible for the remaining criminals to predict, because they are used to fighting guards who follow rules and criminals who fight for money. But H follows neither set of rules, and that is what makes him so dangerous, because he is willing to take risks that ordinary people would never consider, and he does not hesitate when the situation becomes deadly, and the criminals begin realizing that their greatest mistake was not choosing the wrong target or miscalculating the amount of security at Fortico. Their greatest mistake was creating an enemy who had already sacrificed everything before the confrontation even began. And this is the central tragedy of H's character, because his willingness to die is also evidence of how completely grief has consumed him, and throughout the movie we have watched him become more and more isolated, refusing emotional attachments, avoiding questions about his past, and treating every relationship as secondary to his mission. And now that the mission is reaching its end, the consequences of that isolation become clear, because H has almost nothing waiting for him after revenge. And yet he continues forward, because revenge has become his identity. And as the criminals try to escape, regroup, and protect themselves, H follows them with the same cold determination he has shown since entering Fortico. And every attempt to stop him fails, because he understands how they think, where they are likely to move, and what they are likely to do when frightened. And this knowledge comes from years spent inside the same criminal world. And the movie uses this advantage to make the final chase feel almost inevitable, because H has spent the entire story preparing for this moment, while the criminals have only just realized that they are being hunted. And there is a major difference between someone reacting to danger and someone who has planned their entire life around confronting it. And H is the second kind of man. And this is why, even when the odds appear to be against him, he remains calm, because he has already imagined this confrontation many times, and he has already accepted the possibility that he may not survive it. And as the final confrontation moves forward, the movie continues revealing more about the emotional wound that created H, showing that his son was not involved in his criminal life and had no understanding of the dangerous world surrounding his father. And this makes the boy's death even more tragic, because he became a victim of a world he never chose to enter. And H's guilt comes from the belief that his own past helped create the circumstances that made his son vulnerable. And this guilt is one of the reasons revenge became so powerful, because H is not only angry at the criminals, he is also angry at himself. And he has spent years trying to punish others for a tragedy he may secretly believe he could have prevented. And this gives his violence another emotional layer, because every criminal he confronts represents a part of the world that H believes destroyed his family, and every victory gives him a temporary sense that he is getting closer to correcting something that can never actually be corrected. And this is why the ending is deliberately bleak, because even if H kills every person responsible, his son will still be gone, and the past will remain unchanged. And the film understands this, which is why it does not treat revenge as a simple path to happiness. Instead, it shows revenge as a mission that can provide purpose without providing peace. And H is the perfect example of that idea, because he has become extremely powerful but emotionally empty. And once his mission is complete, the question is what remains of him. And as the final enemies fall, the answer seems to be almost nothing, because the identity he created around revenge has consumed nearly everything else. And this is what separates Wrath of Man from a conventional revenge movie, because the protagonist does not walk away from the final battle celebrating. He does not suddenly discover a new life waiting for him, and he does not find emotional closure in the traditional sense. Instead, he simply completes the task he gave himself and accepts the silence that follows. And this silence is important, because it allows the audience to feel the emotional weight of what has happened. And after all the gunfire, explosions, robberies, betrayals, and tactical battles, there is no triumphant feeling. Only the realization that H has finally reached the end of a road that began with his son's death. And this makes the final moments feel almost tragic rather than victorious, because H has achieved exactly what he wanted, but what he wanted was created by loss, and therefore the achievement cannot restore anything. And this also explains why H has never cared much about the money throughout the story, because money is simply the object that connects the criminals to the system. while the real target is the people behind the violence, and once those people are exposed, the money loses its importance. And H's focus remains on the personal debt he believes must be settled. And this brings the movie back to its title, Wrath of Man, because the word wrath does not simply describe H's anger. It describes the transformation of a grieving human being into a force driven almost entirely by rage. And that rage has made him capable of surviving situations that would destroy most people, but it has also taken away the parts of him that might have allowed him to move forward. And this is why his story feels like a tragedy disguised as an action thriller, because beneath the armored trucks and gunfights is a man who has been unable to accept the death of his child, and instead of learning to live with the loss, he turns the loss into a mission. And once that mission is complete, he is left with the same loss he started with. And perhaps that is the most painful truth in the entire story. Because revenge can punish the people who caused your pain, but it cannot erase the pain itself. And H's journey demonstrates this perfectly, because no matter how many criminals he defeats, the memory of his son remains, and the years he spent hunting the killers cannot be returned. And as the final confrontation reaches its conclusion, the criminals finally understand the full scale of their mistake, because they thought they were dealing with a security guard. Then they thought they were dealing with an unusually skilled fighter, and finally they realize they are dealing with a man whose entire life has been shaped by revenge. And by the time they understand that truth, it is too late, because H has already followed them to the end, and the final moments of the conflict become the culmination of everything the movie has been building toward, with H using his experience, patience, and ruthless determination to finish the people responsible. And once the last major obstacle is removed, the story begins slowing down, allowing the audience to process what has happened. And this slower feeling is important, because the movie has spent so much time moving through violence and suspense that the ending needs space to reveal the emotional cost. And H's victory feels strangely empty because there is no celebration, only completion. And this reinforces the idea that his mission was never about creating a better future. It was about closing the past. And now the past has finally been confronted. But H still has to live with everything that happened. And even though he has survived, survival does not necessarily mean healing. And this is one of the strongest themes running through the story, because H's physical strength is enormous, but his emotional wound is something that bullets cannot destroy. And that contrast makes him a fascinating character, because he can defeat armed criminals with frightening efficiency, yet he cannot defeat the memory of his son. And the film deliberately leaves that emotional contradiction unresolved, because sometimes the most powerful ending is not one where every problem is solved, but one where the audience understands that some wounds cannot be solved at all. And H's wound is exactly that kind. And when we look back at his journey, every stage suddenly makes more sense. His decision to join Fortico, his silence around co-workers, his unusual interest in robberies, his willingness to enter dangerous situations, his ability to remain calm under fire, and his obsession with identifying the criminals. Because all of these actions were connected to the same purpose. And this also changes the way we understand his relationship with Bullet. Because Bullet represents a possible version of H's life. A man who works a dangerous job, develops friendships, goes home, and continues living despite the risks, while H has chosen a completely different path, and he cannot fully accept that ordinary life anymore because his mind is trapped in the moment of his son's death. And this is why H never fully opens himself to the people around him, because doing so would mean acknowledging that life continues. And he has spent years refusing to accept that it should, and revenge allows him to remain connected to the past, even if that connection is painful. And once revenge is complete, that connection begins disappearing, leaving H with an emptiness that the movie intentionally refuses to fill. And this makes the ending more emotionally complicated than a simple hero versus villain victory, because H is not entirely heroic, and the criminals are not the only people capable of violence. H himself has returned to the world of violence and used its methods to achieve his goal. And the difference is that H believes his violence is justified by what happened to his son. But the film allows us to question whether personal justice can ever truly justify such destruction. And this moral ambiguity gives the story its darker tone, because the audience can understand why H wants revenge without necessarily believing that revenge will make him whole. And this distinction is important because it prevents the movie from becoming a simple celebration of violence. Instead, the action becomes a reflection of H's emotional state: cold, brutal, controlled, and ultimately empty. And as the final scenes unfold, the consequences of the criminals' choices become clear, because their greed brought them into conflict with a man they never understood, and their willingness to treat human lives as obstacles eventually created an enemy who was willing to treat them the same way. And this creates a kind of dark symmetry, because the criminals used violence without thinking about the consequences, while H spends years thinking about the consequences of the violence they committed, and eventually those consequences return to them. And when the final target is confronted, H does not need a long speech, because his entire journey has already explained his motivation. And the weight of the moment comes from the knowledge that both sides understand what this confrontation means. One side fighting to survive, and the other fighting because survival no longer matters as much as revenge. And H's willingness to continue despite the danger ultimately gives him the advantage. But even after the final enemy is defeated, the emotional problem remains, because H still has to live with the memory of his son. And this is where the movie's final message becomes clear. Revenge can end a conflict, but it cannot restore what was lost. And a person can spend years becoming stronger, more dangerous, and more determined, yet none of that can change the past. And H's tragedy is that he has sacrificed his future trying to correct something that cannot be corrected. And by the time he reaches the end, there is almost nothing left except the memory that started everything. And that is why the ending feels cold, because H does not become a happier man after revenge, he simply becomes a man who has finished what he came to do. And perhaps this is exactly what the title suggests. The wrath has reached its destination, but the anger has not magically disappeared. Because anger can be used as fuel for years, but once the target is gone, the person who depended on that anger may discover that the fire has consumed much more than expected. And H is left standing at the end of that fire, having survived the physical battle but carrying the emotional consequences. And when we look at the entire story from beginning to end, Wrath of Man becomes a portrait of how grief can transform a person, how violence can create more violence, and how revenge can become an identity that is difficult to escape. And H's story is powerful because he is not simply a man looking for revenge. He is a man who has allowed revenge to replace the life he lost. And that makes his final victory both satisfying and tragic at the same time. Because the criminals responsible for his son's death are finally punished, but H does not get his son back. He does not regain the years he lost, and he does not suddenly recover the person he was before the tragedy. And that is why the ending stays with the audience, because it reminds us that some victories come with a cost so high that they can never feel completely victorious. And H's final journey is exactly that kind of victory, a mission completed at the expense of almost everything else. And as the story closes, the armored trucks, the money, the criminal organizations, and the violence begin to feel secondary to the central truth that has been hidden underneath the entire movie. H was a father before he was a criminal, a security guard, or a killer, and his greatest motivation was not greed or power, but the loss of his son. And every violent step he took afterward was an attempt to make sense of that loss. And although he never truly finds peace, he finally reaches the end of the path he created for himself, leaving the audience with a dark and unforgettable image of a man who became almost unstoppable because there was nothing left in his life that he was afraid to lose. And that is ultimately what makes Wrath of Man such a brutal and compelling revenge thriller. Because beneath its armored vehicles, shootouts, robberies, betrayals, and tactical action is a simple but devastating idea. When a man loses the person he loves most and allows grief to become revenge, he may become powerful enough to destroy everyone responsible, but he can never destroy the memory of what he lost.